Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. And I come from the Information and Communication Sciences, so I will talk about how people have been creating, managing, sharing, dealing with information online during crisis situations. I will do so through two case studies that I've been working on in the past years, and then I will give some more general insights. So first case is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. For the younger here, I will just give a bit of context. So this is basically a disaster inside another disaster. The nuclear disaster was the result of the enormous tsunami that hit the eastern coast of Japan on the 11th of March 2011. The tsunami itself killed something like 100,000 people. But it also affected a lot of infrastructures, and it hit quite hard a nuclear power plant that was just on the coast. Nuclear power plant that was called Fukushima Daiichi. And this resulted in the loss of all cooling system in the plant, leading in the following days and weeks in the release of radioactive materials into the environment, contaminating the air, the water, the soil, the crop, basically. That's a very bad situation. So this was handled by a large evacuation around the area, an evacuation that has been quite difficult and that lasted for quite a while. Some areas are still not back to normal. So one of the tricks with nuclear disaster is that radioactivity is invisible, and you can only assess it through measurement devices, like Geiger counter, which are quite rare, quite complicated to use, and quite expensive. Before this disaster, Japan already had a large network of measurement stations operated by the government, but you need not to forget about the tsunami, and the tsunami had damaged some of those stations, particularly the ones that were the closest to Fukushima. So when this nuclear disaster was beginning to set off, people were unable to have information about whether or not there was a radioactive contamination. This state of uncertainty is not something very comfortable to live with in such situation. And so people have been trying to deal with it in two ways. Firstly, by scraping all the information that was available, because even without that network of measurement stations, there were some measurements available on university websites, through prefectures, through individual researchers. And so they started to scrape, harvest, collect, map, graph all this data that was available. And some people also started to make their own measurements, because even if those devices are rare, they are not completely rare. And some people had access to Geiger counter, so they started to make measurements and to share them through weblogs, through webcams, through Twitter. In the first weeks, it was quite an individual and do-it-yourself process. But then some bigger projects have been set up. I will just present two of them. First one is SafeCast. SafeCast is a project that was born in the Tokyo hackerspace with strong links with some American hackerspaces. And they developed a Geiger counter that was quite easy to manipulate and that would send its data back to a unique server where they could easily map this data on one collective map. So they built, I think in the end, a few hundred of those Geiger counter, and they collected data by walking around in the street, by tying those devices to cars, to bikes, and they managed to have a very precise map of the radioactive contamination, something more precise than what the government could do at that time. So they are still collecting, a bit less now, but still. And an interesting point is that since they saw that it was quite well working and it was interesting people, they're starting also to monitor other things. They have developed tools to measure air pollution and particles in the air, meaning that this project may live on, even if the focus on radioactive substances is a bit lower right now. So this project just set up is kind of code. And what we see here is that Safecast is really focused on making good data. They want to have full control on the process, so they build their own devices. They are not giving those devices to everyone. They are mainly giving them inside a small community of 100, a bit more, participants who follow a very strict protocol to collect data. This data is all in one place. It's well curated, and it's released under public domain license, something like CC0, I think. So this project is aiming at producing very high-level data. On another end, another project, Radiation Watch, was a bit different. It was created by a small team at the Electrocommunication University of Tokyo. And they developed a smaller device that can be plugged to a mobile phone. And through an application, you can measure radioactivity. And you have a map of the measurement you have made and the measurements that other people have made. The trick is that they don't use a Geiger counter for that. They use a new technology that they developed using diode and stuff that I don't understand, which result in being far cheaper than a normal Geiger counter. I mean, normal Geiger counter is very expensive. Even the Safecast ones are a few $100, but this one is $50. And so the goal is very different. Here, it's not about having high precision data, because this device is a bit less precise than a Geiger counter. Not that bad, but not very precise. And to measure, it takes a bit long time. You have to set it and wait. But the aim was to provide more devices to more people so that people can measure their own environment and make decisions based on this kind of data, deciding whether they will go to this park or that park, deciding whether it is doable to use that garden and grow vegetable in it or not. So the focus was less on the quality of data, but more on having citizens to use it, and citizens to measure by themselves and be involved in that measurement activity, and to discuss about it in online communities. So we can see that for the same kind of information and the same disaster, there can be different approaches which result in different type of data. Second example will be, as everybody expects, on COVID-19. And here I've been working mostly on the data that is produced and shared on Wikipedia. So, well, we don't need context for this one. It's far too recent. And yet, what is important is that for this kind of crisis too, data is important. I mean, radioactivity is invisible, but a pandemic is kind of invisible too. When you look around, you just see, well, oh yeah, this person got sick and that one too, and that one is not. But you cannot see a pandemic, not by looking around you. To see a pandemic, you have to use epidemiological data, meaning that you have a view at a large scale, a country or the world. You have a temporal view, you know how the contamination is evolving in time. And so this has been the main way to communicate about this crisis, both by experts, but also in the media and between people. People have been talking about while the curve is going up or down, the curve is flattened or not, and so on. So this is very important for this crisis. Also interesting is the fact that the World Health Organization has coined a new term, which is infodemic, meaning that for this crisis, the problem was not, like for Fukushima, that we lack information, but that we have too much information. Too much information of different quality Some very good, some low, some difficult to assess. And so this is a very different context than the Fukushima one. The problem was not to produce data, but to make sense of data, to manage the quantity of data. On Wikipedia, they have been doing quite a lot of work on this, because, well, on the English Wikipedia, they produced a few thousand articles on COVID-related issues. In the French Wikipedia, it's a few hundred. That's quite a lot. There is a lot of articles on Wikipedia in COVID on a given country, COVID on a given community, this kind of vaccine, this kind of mask, this kind of protest against governmental policies, and so on and so on. What we have seen from those articles, and this is not my work, is that basically it was quite well sourced. People have been using sources from reputable press agencies, from reputable scientific journals. They are not using that much preprint. They are not using that much blog posts from we don't know who. And this is not new on Wikipedia. There have been recommendations on how to source data for quite a while on Wikipedia. Recommendations that were developed by the community itself. So that's interesting too. But what we see here is that while we could have expected that during crisis people would less follow the rules, basically they have been following quite well those rules, leading to a quality of articles that is somehow in the standard of the encyclopedia. We have seen also that the editors have been relying quite a lot on tools that were developed inside the community before the crisis to deal with bad information or people trying to tamper with information. Basically, they have developed quite a long time ago tools to say, well, be careful, this article might be subject to controversies. Be careful, this article is talking about a recent event. They have developed also tools to block users who have been trying to put weird stuff into the encyclopedia. They have tools to protect pages. Pages that are attacked frequently are blocked, and some categories of users can edit, some cannot. And those tools have been used quite a lot during the pandemic too, showing that the community itself has been very careful about the quality of information and has been doing quite a lot to avoid the spread of misleading information or false information. When speaking about more precisely epidemiological data, of course there is a lot of it on those articles, a lot of numbers, a lot of graphs, a lot of maps. And we see also that the editors have been taking quite a lot of care in explaining this data. Not only sourcing this data, saying, well, those numbers have been produced by the ARS or something else, but explaining, well, this is what those data means, this is what we don't know about this data, this is a kind of bias that may affect this data. In some cases, they are also explaining weird data. For example, there have been cases in which the government have been reporting -2 deaths in a day. Well, it's not resurrection. It's usually because they have been changing the way they calculate numbers. And so those need explanation. Otherwise, we can just say, OK, this data is worthless, or the government is lying to us. So there has been a lot of effort in explaining the data, which was quite interesting. The maps have been very numerous too. Well, this is a paper that is not evaluated yet, so I don't know if it will be published. And yet we see that people have been developing very complex maps, also very simple ones. Some people have been just taking data for one region and one day and putting that in a map, and that's a map. But some other people have been updating a map with very robust sources for months, and having those maps with a lot of indication on how to read and so on. So they have also developed some tools to do so. Some users develop bots robots, to automatically update diagrams and maps. We can see that it is not just small activities, it's complex activities that are developed by citizens. Not just I publish some data and then I forget, but some people who have been involved for quite a long time, who have been working on complex data with complex tools, some tools that they had to create themselves in order to deal with this data. We have seen also attempts to find consensus on how to present data, which color to use, which scale to use. Well, in that case, it didn't work very well, but it at least shows that it is not isolated people working on their own, but people who know that other people are working on similar issues. People who are exchanging tools, exchanging ideas on how to deal with this data. And that's interesting too. From those examples and also a few others, I've come up with, well, I've written a recommendation, but it's more like avenues for future research or avenues for thinking. First one is about the term citizens. Well, that's the one I'm using, that's the one we are all using, and that's the one I think is quite problematic. Because when we are talking about citizens, what we mean is non-experts, meaning people who are not experts of crisis management. Yes, that's what they are, but they are experts of other things. They have jobs, they have training, and also they have an expertise in their own community, they are an expertise of their own environment. I mean, someone who has been living in a farm for 50 years is probably the person who knows that environment the best. And yet, often when we develop projects to gather knowledge from citizens, it's a bit like click button participation. You enter a number and that's all. We usually don't have projects that allow people to give a large variety of contribution. We don't allow people to take part in organizing the project, in helping other people contributing and so on. And that's one problem. Another one is that among those citizens, well, some have difficulties to access our project because they have disabilities, but disabilities is just not only physical disabilities. It can be just not having money. It's kind of a disability. Not being able to read a certain language. That's a disability. Some of them just don't trust the government or the scientists. Some of them are not well integrated into society, and so they cannot contribute. The trick is that those two categories overlap. And some of the people who cannot contribute in our project are the ones who have the most valuable information to give. And well, one of the things I think is important is that we need to get to know the people we want contribution from. We need to know what they can do for us and what we should do for them in order to have them contribute. Another point is about developing platforms and tools. So yeah, well, first is kind of easy. Just think before you develop stuff. But the second one is interesting too, is that tools are not only technical tools, but they are also social tools, and we need to think about the people we will put into those tools. We need to have people to help users. We need to have people to manage the community. Although without that, it's a bit difficult to have a community of users that are involved, who will stay, will keep contributing for a long time. The main trick is that when in an academic context, usually we work in projects. We have funding for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, if we are very, very lucky. And at the end of that, we have no human resources left. The postdocs are gone. The PhD students are gone, one way or another. And well, if we have nobody left, usually the community dies out. So that's something that needs to be thought into the project. How will we go on for managing the community and to keep the community alive, particularly if it's a project that needs to stay alive for a long time? Will we find people inside the citizens who will have a role of leaders? Will we have other ways through the cities, through the other associations to have people involved for a long time? This is very, very complicated. But in our academic context, it's usually not working very well. And last but not least, about the data itself, I've been presenting projects that were kind of lucky because either there were not that much bad data, or this bad data was managed quite well. But you have to expect bad data when you develop this kind of project. Bad data is not always just fake news. It can be just mistakes. People make mistakes. People don't use the device the proper way or just type the wrong number here. Or people can also willingly try to mess with your project. So you need to think about ways to verify information, ways to deal with the quality of information. Also, what needs to be sought is a form of reciprocity. If people contribute and give good data, well, what do they get from the project? Is that data still available afterward? Under which conditions? Will the scientific results be available, or will they be published in a review that costs something like a few $1,000s? And that's also something that needs to be taken into consideration. For example, Safecast rely on open source licenses so that all the data is available and will stay available. And by having this data free, just not free by, I mean, not free like gratuit, but free like libre, you will also have a way for this project to stay alive, even after we are done, even after the community dies out. If the data is still available, people can still use it. If it's locked down, if it's only published in scientific papers, then it does not benefit the society, and particularly not those who have contributed to it. So, well, those are a lot of tricky issues, so, well, I don't have any solution to propose to them. Well, thank you.